Welcome once again, as the Ever-Evolving Truth Podcast presents a special docucast, The Unholy Trinity of Cults, Part 2, Jonestown. In 1978, after a U.S. congressman was murdered on the soil of a supposed utopian society, over 900 people committed suicide in Jonestown. Parents killed their own children before drinking the poison themselves. A sad few defectors ran for their lives into the deep, dark South American jungle. Most of the members of the People's Temple obeyed the orders of their God on earth. They laid down their lives at the command, at the raving moans of madness from one Jim Jones.
Welcome, everybody, to the Ever-Evolving Truth. This is episode 2 out of a 3-part series, The Unholy Trinity of Cults. Last week, we talked about Waco. This week, we are talking about, in my opinion, something that's way more disturbing, just from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. I didn't know a whole lot about it because I'm not a cult person. I don't follow cults like Leah and Sterner do. But in watching the documentaries, preparing for this show, it made me feel gross. It really did. And for those of you, it happened before our time, which is part of the reason, it wasn't in our face the entire time, but it's documented so well. There's so many different ways to find out the information and history of this horrible event and the events leading up to it. And Leah's going to take you through them. But if you don't know where this is going or where this is leading, the actual event that is labeled Jonestown happened on November 18th, 1978. 909 inhabitants of Jonestown, 304 of them children, died of apparent cyanide poisoning, mostly in and around the Central Pavilion. And that was a pavilion built in this community that they all ended up moving to. This resulted in the greatest single loss of American civilian life compared to September 11th.
Mm-hmm.
I have that right?
Yeah, you are right. September 11th was worse, but this was from 1978 until then. This was the single greatest loss of American lives in one place at one time in our history, mm-hmm. which should give you some idea about the impact of how Jonestown ended up. But Leah, you're going to take us all the way back to the beginning. This is a terrifying story, and Jeff, I tend to agree with you. I think Jones is the worst of all. We're talking about Waco, we're talking about Jonestown, and we're going to talk about the Manson family. And while they're all horrible, mm-hmm. I think Jones is the worst. I think he was a downright evil man. Yeah. And I don't usually talk like that, but mm-hmm. he was a downright evil man. I think he was born sort of the same type of organism as a Jeffrey Epstein. I think his ultimate game in life was, how can I bend the wills of others and how far can I make it go? And mm-hmm. I think he used everything from God to socialism to just cult mentality, fear. He used it all just to see how far he could bend the wills of other people, taking it all the way to him telling 900 plus people to kill themselves and those people complying. So
not only that, they some of them didn't even want to do it, but they did it because they felt like they had no other way out. There was no other option.
We'll get there. Actually, they didn't do it because they felt they had to. They did it because there was a gun to their head.
Well, no, hold on. Yeah, that is true in some cases. We're going to get there. Mm-hmm. A lot of them, though, were completely devoted, saying they couldn't wait to go with Father, mm-hmm. And all that kind of shit. There was plenty of that 900 who voluntarily committed suicide.
There was.
But like you're saying, there was also people that were maybe bucking against this idea. They got with the program pretty quick, because you've got to remember, by this point, Jim Jones resembled Kurtz from the Heart of Darkness novel. Just this godlike figure that had amassed this massive following out in the jungle, and he was sitting like a god on his throne, mm-hmm. commanding them to do what they did, and they did. But he also had his own private army, essentially, that could ensure that the wills of others would bend. But anyway, Leah's going to give us the biography.
By the end of this, we'll be able to either call it a mass suicide or a mass murder.
We shall see.
That's what I'm hoping.
So that's interesting. Two things really quick before I start his biography. One, Jeff, you said that it wasn't in our faces. I was born 1 day and 3 years after Jonestown, and just about my entire childhood, I remember growing up and seeing documentaries about it. They would I remember the anniversary shows, and Jonestown is how I got obsessed with true crime and cults. It was all thanks to Jim Jones. And also, Sterner, I think I agree
I was watching
with you.
Lassie.
Yeah, you were watching Lassie. I was watching documentaries about Jim Jones. I agree with you, Greg. I think I am not a firm believer. I'm actually very against the whole being born evil. I don't believe a person can be born evil. Jim Jones is the closest thing to being born evil that there possibly is. There's definitely some nurture issues there, but his psychopathy was very vivid in his childhood.
Right.
Or younger days. So his early life, might as well start right back at the beginning. Jim Jones was born on May 13th, 1931 in Crete, Indiana, to Lynetta and James Jones. His father, James, was a World War I vet, and he was on disability. His whole life, he never worked. He was what they would have called back then shell shock, which we call today post-traumatic stress disorder. And
didn't he also have like mustard gas poisoning or burning on his lungs?
So that's what his actual disability was from gas attacks. He was bombed with mustard gas, and he had a lot of health and mental health issues. He was an alcoholic, and Jim later said that his father was the most emotionally absent person on the planet, which I think is a very interesting thing for someone to say.
And I don't think his mom was the most warm individual either.
No, according to Jim, again, too. What we know about Lynetta is that she was a free spirit. She sounds very fun. I'd be interested in talking to a woman like that. She actually, the way she's described, she reminds me a lot of my mother, except for that she has zero maternal instincts, none whatsoever. But she was very, everything got done for Jim. He went to school. He was cared for in the very basic ways that people are cared for. There was no love. There was no affection in his house. At one point during an interview in the 1970s, he was talking about his children and said that he kissed them and told them he loved them every day because it never happened to him once in his life. And that's really sad to think about. But it also explains something, I think, about him. His mother was extremely anti-religion. Now, keep in mind, this is the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. We were still very much one nation under God, and he lived in, the heartland. He grew up in the heartland. He was not in a progressive place at all. And his mom was an atheist. She didn't believe in any sort of quote unquote sky god. But she was spiritual in her own way. But I feel that the reason that he became a Pentecostal preacher is because that was his way of rebelling against his mother and his father.
Well, and also we'll get to this part of it later because it does really come later. But when Jones had developed an ideology, if you want to call it that, who knows what the purpose of his ideology really was? I tend to consider it was always about bending the wills of others. But he had said at one point that his question was, how do I get my Marxist message out there? And he strategically saw infiltrate the church as a tactical move, not necessarily that he thought religion was the way to go in any form or fashion.
I could not agree with you more, and we will get there. And another reason I really dislike Jim Jones is because and we'll get there. This was 1978. But while he was starting his I guess you can say his church, his ministry, we were still in the middle of the Cold War. Communism was incredibly scary to Americans. It still is. And that's what he was preaching, ultimately, was socialism. He was a true Marxist.
He said Russia was the dream example of socialism.
Yes, he did.
What a crazy thing to say in the 60s.
Well, it's a crazy thing to say now. And I consider myself a socialist. That he was not, religion was not his main objective there. It was politics. But back to his early life, his parents were married for 8 years when they got pregnant with Jim, and his mother admitted to him several times that she tried to abort him, but he just wouldn't go away. And she said that was, in her eyes, he said it was a show of how strong he was. But really, it was just like, I don't love you. You know what I mean? But that's how he took it, was a show of how strong he was, that you couldn't even kill him in the womb.
I'd like to know how the abortionists that she was seeing, that she had to go several times.
Right? Well, we're talking 1930. What year was he born? 1931.
A long time ago.
Yeah, we're probably talking coat hangers and crap, but ew. So,
Tune into the abortion episode.
His childhood was really uneventful. Just your basic, 1930s middle class. His mom was very much ostracized, so he didn't get to play with a lot of kids because they thought she was the weird, non-religious lady, right? The free spirit, which was frowned upon. And then in his teen years, when he started high school, he wore his Sunday clothes every day. He was the only kid. He would wear his suit and tie. That's what he wore to high school every day. And it was a way for him to present to the world the way he wanted the world to see him. And to start that at such a young age, I find that to be a very interesting thing about him. But when he started playing sports around 14 or 15, and he wasn't really good at it. But what he was good at, he discovered, was forming teams and being a leader. And he formed an actual team with his neighborhood kids and started a baseball team for his school that went on to be very successful. And he ended up coaching that team. And it was then that he credits to, he knew I knew I'd be a good leader. I'm not a good doer. I'm good at getting people to do things for me, which is another very interesting quote of his.
Also very common among cult leaders.
Yes, very, very common. And he also carried a Bible with everywhere. He got interested with the Bible right around when he started to read. And again, he would listen to these sermons on the radio. He would go to church by himself because his parents were not religious. He would go with his grandparents from time to time. And
almost watch it like a show.
Yes, it was an obsession to him in a way, but it was entertaining. It wasn't, and he said that, but it was specifically Pentecostal preachers and Black Baptist, Christian Baptist. He very much was attracted to the Black Christian Baptists. So, and he would.
Well, it seems pretty clear why too, if you know the ending to the story.
Well, yeah.
He admired the fact that these human beings could rally people around and just say, well, just trust your faith. With
right.
No facts, no proof, nothing. They rile these people up and believe these things that there's no proof of.
Right, exactly. I couldn't agree more. But he would preach from that Bible in the middle of the streets. He would hop up on a soapbox and he would start preaching to people. And he started doing it so often that he gained a small following of people that would show up every day.
Like knew when 14 or 15 kids, right?
Yeah, like that would stay there. And he would also, he started to get money for it. People would put money at his feet to help him start a ministry. And I think that's where a light clicked on for him.
And he used civil rights to attract.
Well, we're getting there.
Oh,
so
I don't want to jump ahead of you.
At 17 years old, he became an orderly in a hospital. And he loved it. He loved medicine. He loved all of it. But what's really interesting is his position, his job at that hospital as the orderly, was to dispose of amputated limbs. And he said later that it was the most fulfilling work he had ever done in his life, which again leans towards my psychopathy. Who on earth just thinks that's fulfilling? I'm
a little surprised that young Jim didn't have more friends. And real quick about that time at the hospital, and if you were going to get there, I apologize, Leah, but he was already showing signs of the sadism that would really come to light in when Jonestown was in full prominence, but more than Jonestown, the People's Temple was in full swing. He had a very sadistic streak. But while he was at that hospital, a childhood friend of his who also worked as an orderly there said that Jim Jones tried to get him to abuse someone that was in traction. Their neck was in traction. The guy was trying to give him a shave, so he lathered him up and all that. Jones took such umbrage to the way he was doing it. He basically chastised his friend, sent him back, and then took the straight razor to this guy in traction and made his cheeks bleed because of how aggressively he was shaving him. And then he gave this look, a look that his friend, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the friend's name, but a look that friend described as a really weird look that
like a smirk.
A smirk, something that always followed Jones doing something sadistic. And then this look would happen. So he's already showing signs of it as a kid, stabbing cats and being brutal to these patients. Go ahead.
Well, his friend also described that patient that you're talking about had tears running down his cheeks while Jim Jones was doing that to him. And that's when he looked back and gave that smirk.
Yeah, he was enjoying every minute of that.
That is an evil. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, he truly is. But ironically enough, while he was there, he managed to find himself a wife. He met his future wife, Marceline, while working at the hospital together. And they married shortly thereafter. They got married in June of 1949. And Marceline was under the impression that Jim was a basic Christian until she married him. And she said it wasn't until after that, after talking to him and seeing the way he was, that her God, although both were the Christian gods, her God was not the same as his. And she would try to argue him until she said, he brought me to the light and showed me that this is the way it should be. So again, he picks a woman that he can keep under, but smart. Marceline was very smart. She eventually ended up running the church, basically. He did the sermons. She did everything else. But they started going to churches after they found that, because they wanted to find a church where they were able to express their Christianity and their way of loving God in the way that they expected everyone to do it, the way everyone should. And she said that her Christian upbringing was very sad and depressing. So they started going to Black churches, Black Baptist churches, with the singing and the dancing and all that kind of stuff. And Jim Jones was like, see, this is how you worship God. This is the way it should be. These people have it wrong. But our people, the white people, we have it wrong. These Black people, this is the way to go. And he was accepting and loving, and people started to flock to him. He just had this natural charisma. And he became a junior pastor at the age of 21 in 1952 at that Black church. He was the first white pastor there, period. But he was being told how to preach and what to preach. And Jim Jones did not like that. So in 1953, he started his own church in Indianapolis.
Now, real quick before we get there, and that's essentially the beginning of the People's Temple.
Essentially.
he was supplementing his income when he was a youth pastor. He was supplementing his income by selling monkeys, of all things.
Yeah.
He was
God, I don't know how I forgot to put that in the notes. Keep going.
Well,
I'm sorry.
in one of these documentaries too, and they gloss right over it. But one of the eventual cult members had owned a monkey, and the monkey hung itself.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure what a good monkey owner she was. She drove the poor simian to suicide. But Jones was selling his monkeys, so that's how this person who eventually died in Jonestown got hooked up with Jim Jones to begin with, because he was selling these spider monkeys that he would import from was it Africa? I forget where he was getting them from.
It was,
It was something like that. Yeah, this is the Friends monkey or the Outbreak monkey, not a chimpanzee. Just so you know.
Yeah, the little tiny ones.
And during right before, while he was still involved in the black church, and he was figuring it out. As you said, Lee, he was figuring out how to do this. Around that time, this was when he first witnessed a faith healing service at a Seventh-day Baptist church.
Yeah.
That's going to weigh in really heavily to what he does to manipulate the People's Temple, and also in 56, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
He arranged a giant religious convention, like one of those revival deals, right? Mm-hmm. And had a couple of well-known evangelists there, and drew a big crowd from bouncing off of that event. Mm-hmm. He was then able to begin his own church after that, which is where you ended up.
It is. And so the original church, the one I was talking about, was in a low-income area in Indianapolis. And he goes and he sees this faith healing, right? And he's like, I can do that. I can start healing people. So he started out really slow, right? He starts out with like headaches or my arthritis. And kind of the things that you can mind over matter make people think I'm healed, right? And he starts small and he keeps getting bigger, but he realizes that he can't keep getting bigger because eventually he can't pull people from the congregation. So he pulls his friends in on this, people that he knows but don't really belong to the church, or one was a secretary at the church. That one's famous. So his secretary was in a wheelchair. Mm-hmm. And
made up to look like an old woman.
Yes, made up to look like an old woman. She doesn't even look like herself when you see the pictures side by side. And he goes over and he puts his hands on her and he's like, you're healed. And she stands up and she starts dancing and she's kicking her feet and the crowd goes wild. Mm-hmm. These people truly believed that he was healing these people because they're seeing it with their own two eyes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's interesting to point out too that some of his close friends challenged him, like,
"Yes,
dude, this isn't real," and he admitted it to him.
Yeah,
well, because he believed that the ends justified the means, just like a Jonas Nightingale figure, that Steve Martin movie, Leap of Faith, just like a figure like that, where he's like, well, they bought it, right? So like the what was intended was eventually accomplished. And when Leah said he started small, originally it was like he'd find out things about people in the audience, and he would just call them out from the pulpit as though he was getting divine information, right? And then as you said, right, and then he eventually escalated to these types of, you see it from Peter Pan and people like that are these charlatans that do fake faith healing. But these people, as Leah said, lost their minds. They believed in this man as a healer, that he was touched by God with some kind of power.
And that's when he started collecting money. He started with the collection plates, and people were giving them his life savings, because he went to his congregation and said, because his congregation was getting bigger, right? He's in this low income area in this small church, and now he's healing people. So people are coming from all over. Even at this point, people are coming from other parts of the country that are hearing about this to join his church, moving across the country to be healed by this man who is a complete and utter charlatan. And he's making money off them because they want to be able to be part of this church. And he's like, look, I can't heal you unless you're a congregant. I can't do it. So if you're one of my followers, I can heal you, but we need a bigger church. So people started giving him money to do that. So he did eventually was able to move on up and get a much, much bigger place. And he purchased a church that could hold up to 700 people at a time. And that was the beginning of the People's Temple.
And he packed that sucker. Now, real quick before we go to break, because we're going to break, and then in the next segment we're going to talk about some of his racial integration work. We're going to talk a little bit about his, quote, rainbow family. We're going to talk about some of the good that he did in the region during the rise of the People's Temple, and then we're going to talk about how it all started to fall apart. And the People's Temple started to become a mobile temple that kept having to go to different places for these crazy reasons, but eventually it was all going to lead to it inevitably was going to lead to Jonestown. But before we get there and go to that break, I did want to just put in a quick note here. Jim Jones was known to regularly study Adolf Hitler and a guy named Father Divine, who you guys may not be familiar with. He died in 1965, but he was known as Reverend Major Jealous Divine. That was the name he gave himself to describe, because he was God. He professed to be God. He was also known as the Messenger. But anyway, he founded the International Peace Mission movement, and he became a mentor of sorts to Jim Jones, who sought his expertise in getting a movement to follow you. And one thing that Father Divine told Jim Jones was to learn how to manipulate the members of your People's Temple. He goes, you need to personally find an enemy to make sure they know who the enemy is, as it will unify those in the group and make them subservient to you.
Subservient. Remember that word. That's very important.
That's right. So we're gonna take a quick pause for the cause here. We will be back with the next segment as we talk about some of the good, and then we start to see it all fall apart. And then in that third segment, get ready to go dark, because we're gonna go real dark. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Ever-Evolving Truth. We are, I would say, thigh deep in the Jonestown mud. Bringing you the second segment here that Greg's going to lead us into. And you're going to talk about some good that Jim Jones potentially caused. Although I believe it was, I don't believe it. Whatever good he caused, it was just like a byproduct of him using that cause to manipulate people.
Yeah, it's a bad person doing good things for bad reasons.
Right. It was like it was
Go
good
Cosby.
by accident.
Yeah. Actually, the Cosby's not the worst comparison to draw, because like look at all he was trying to do all this stuff for the black community, but at the same time, like his whole game was that I'm the exalted figure of the black community, and I'm above the everyday person, which means I can get away with things that they can't because they're worth less than me.
Right.
And I think that's how Jim Jones looked at the world too. But he looked at socialism and he looked at a racial integration as things that could help him get public support. It's no small thing to say that the vast majority of the People's Temple membership was older black women.
Yes.
So
the vast majority.
This movement of his really, he had a way to he knew that these were the way to get people on board. He studied Gandhi, he studied Christ, he studied Hitler, he studied all these different people. Father Divine of all, he studied the art of doing this, and he became very good. You
know what else really quick that I heard a lot, and I hear this a lot, like back in the same time, like the same era, women talking about like who they're voting for president. It's always like they lead off with, well, he was a very attractive man. Like that seemed to like really, really draw people in, women especially. And that just, I don't know how to feel about that.
Well, with Jim Jones, I don't think it's a really fair comparison, but about the looks thing, I think with he's handsome, women like that, right? People like pretty people. But with Jim Jones, and we'll get there, he was a sex addict, without a doubt, no question, a sex addict. And he would make people fall in love with him. He knew that was the best way to get laid as much as possible. So I think he was handsome, but it's mostly because of his charm.
Yeah. Listen, and just real quick, I tried that myself. I failed miserably. Maybe it's because I'm not handsome.
Well, that's and you're also not, the child of the Lord, so that could be part of it.
That's my biggest downfall. Yeah,
that we know of yet. He's still young.
That's true.
Who knows what he's going to do? So speaking of his looks, real quick, if you have not seen a picture of Jim Jones before, he looks like a cross between Elvis and Javier Bardem.
Yeah, and I want to punch him in his face every time I see those damn sunglasses.
And he always wore sunglasses. Now, his excuse for the sunglasses, he obviously used it as an image, a point of image, to project a larger-than-life image.
Yeah.
He always wore these trademark dark glasses for the rest of his life, from very early on in the People's Temple. And he said it was because he was infused with such a high degree of the Spirit of God that he needed this as some kind of a barrier, or like a muting of the bright light of the Spirit that's just infused him, which was obviously bullshit. But it's not a simple story to say that yes, they did good, and then it was good, and then it got really, really, really bad. Mm-hmm. It's funny because the rise of the People's Temple, it part of that rise is all the good and influence they were able to have. But while this was going on, it was at the same time that things started to fall apart, in the sense that Jones became abusive toward his flock. He became the wrong kind of cult leader. He became somebody that was now he felt like he owned these people, and he was their lord, and he would rule them essentially. And you start to see the beginnings of that here, even as the People's Temple is rising. So let's go a little bit. Let's talk about this rainbow family that is often mentioned. In 1954, the Jones family adopted Agnes, who was part Native American. 59, they adopted 3 Korean-American children named Lou, Stephanie, and Suzanne, the latter of whom was adopted at age 6. He very much pushed the idea for the rest of the People's Temple to also adopt children from North Korea. He felt that North Korea was an example of socialism gone off the rails, and that South Korea was a powerful example of the abiding of socialism, surviving even in the cruelest, most unfriendly place to it, that it was able to survive. In 59, Jones and Marceline had their only biological kid, and they named him Stephen Gandhi Jones. It's spelled Stefan.
Talk about a God complex. You named your kid Gandhi.
And then from there in 61, they were the first white couple in the history of the state of Indiana to adopt an African American kid, and they named him Jim Jones Jr. or James Warren Jones Jr.
That is such a big, important, key thing in my eyes. He has 9 children, 9, one of them biologically his. He waits to name the child after him to be the first Black child in his family, but also in the state to be adopted by a white family. That was done on purpose. That was his ego. That's all that was. And his son is still alive. One of the extreme few. There's only 2 that survived. He even said that his father always
Jim Jones Jr. and Stephen are both still alive.
Yeah, they were at a basketball tournament actually. But Jim Jones Jr. says all the time that his father would introduce him as, "This is my son, the first Black child adopted by a white family in Indianapolis." Every time some people are the pretty ones, some people he was a trophy. That's all he was to Jim Jones.
Well, Jim Jones Jr. actually said at one point that he did love Jim Jones, but he also hated him. And this was after Jonestown and the massacre. They also adopted a white son named Timothy Glenn, and that her birth mother was a member of the temple. Marceline and Jim Jones adopted her. During the same time, Jones actually helped greatly to integrate churches, restaurants, even amusement parks, hospitals, things like that. He was a great part of integrating the community as much as possible. And what he would do, to use the restaurant example quick, he would go to a non-integrated restaurant where segregation was still in play, and he would say, "Look, I'll fill this place up. I will fill this place up and make you more money than you've made before, but you've got to desegregate. You've got to allow blacks in." And some of these restaurants would do it, and then Jim Jones would bring giant groups of the People's Temple in to populate these restaurants during off hours when money wasn't really being made to begin with, and they would make these restaurants money. So there was an incentive there for them to desegregate, which is an interesting way to do it. Now, as this is happening, the abuses in the church start to get a little bit out of hand. Former members, defectors from the People's Temple, have come out subsequently in the years gone by and said that he became more extreme, manipulating his congregants with blackmail, administering humiliating beatings to those who displeased him. This eventually just got crazy when they got to Jonestown, which we'll go into in a bit. Former members said they already knew that he was abusing drugs, amphetamines, and alcohol. And one of the former members had mentioned punishment became a normal thing. His behavior became totally irrational. You begin to just go with the flow out of fear of the fact that if you left the church, what you might experience, what danger might be brought to you. Around that same time, Jones began banning extramarital sex among the temple members as he engaged in sexual relationships with both male and female temple members outside of his marriage to Marceline. According,
what a hypocrite.
Right.
Well, yes, and apparently there was not much sex happening with Marceline at this point. After the biological kid was born, apparently they were not a very intimate couple. So Jones started to take on mistresses. The first, which in '68 was temple member Carolyn Layton, who actually remained with him until the events at Jonestown. He was also engaged in a relationship with temple member Maria Kitsaris, which began in '74, also lasted to the end. He had many other mistresses during the '70s, but in the book The Road to Jonestown by Jeff Gwynne, he states Jones had occasional sex with male followers, but never as often as he did with women. Gwynne states that Jones was most likely bisexual, but that his main physical and sexual attraction was toward women. Jones, however, claimed that he detested engaging in homosexual activity and only did so for the male temple adherents' own good, purportedly to connect with them symbolically within himself. Jones is on record telling followers he was the only true heterosexual on the planet.
So 2 things real quick about that. One, there's a great documentary called The Women of Jonestown. It is about Marceline and his 2 mistresses and how they basically perpetrated it. They made the Kool-Aid and they forced people to drink it. They were there. They talked people into it. And they gave it to the children. It was them. And second, about the gay sex thing, I have never met a straight man who has ever even been slightly bi-curious. This guy took straight men and got them to sleep with him willingly so they can connect. This is the kind of charisma this guy had.
What an amazing heterosexual he was.
Right?
I see Mounts do that on a Tuesday night.
Well, that's Mounts, though. I mean, not everybody can be Mounts.
He was the ultimate heterosexual.
I understand that Mounts has already started the first steps of his own cult, which I'll happily join if it gets going. So around the period where things were building up, we're jumping around on the timeline a little bit. You know, we're mentioning things that happened all the way into the '70s, but let's go back to '62 for a second. He read an article in Esquire magazine, which stated that the area that they were in Indiana, was going to be a safe harbor in the event of an atomic exchange. So Jones became extremely paranoid and started developing major fears about nuclear war. And he traveled with his family to Belo Horizonte, Brazil, with the idea of setting up a new temple location to protect his followers in a place that was not going to be hit by the nuclear conflicts that he felt were coming to this area of the States. He spent a lot of time in Brazil. While he was there, his congregation fell apart. They were essentially down. They whittled down to below 100 members while he was in Brazil. He became plagued by feelings of guilt, allegedly, of abandoning the civil rights struggle in Indiana and possibly losing what he tried to build there. Like, it could have been all gone since he had no congregation left. The associate preachers that were still operating the People's Temple for him in Indiana told him, things are about to collapse without you. We need you back. So he returned from Brazil, and he told his Indiana congregation, he said that soon, he said that there would be a new socialist Eden on earth.
Yes.
But it would come after the world would be engulfed by nuclear war, and that the temple had to move to Northern California, specifically Ukiah, for safety. And eventually they moved the whole congregation and now he had already built up some new membership once he got back, so it was bigger than less than 100 people, which is where it had fallen to. They eventually moved to California to start essentially what was like a farming community, but they started to get, this was where the real influence of the People's Temple started to happen. So I want to go to something else. He began to writing in the early 70s now. So this is in 67, they moved to California. By the early 70s, 71 specifically, we're going to play a clip here in a second, Jones began deriding Christianity as flyaway religion, rejecting the Bible as being a tool to oppress women and non-whites, and denouncing a, quote, sky god. Doesn't that sound familiar, Leah? Who was no god at all. He wrote a booklet called The Letter Killeth, criticizing the King James Bible. He also began preaching that he was the reincarnation of Father Divine, Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus, Buddha, and Vladimir Lenin. And okay, so I'm going to play you a quick clip here of Jim Jones in 1971. He is preaching to the People's Temple. Now, I want you to listen to Jim Jones in this clip. This is a very different Jim Jones than we're going to hear in the final clip. But here he is, and I believe in this speech, he is setting himself up as God. Essentially, he is starting to he's trying to take religion out of this whole thing so he can be the one and only true God that is going to basically lead his people to the salvation that they're all looking for. So we're going to play this clip. I'm going to share the audio with you quickly, and you're going to get to hear Jim Jones in 1971. So let me go ahead and share this in just a moment. All right, here we go. And listen up here, and you'll hear what I'm talking about.
This administration is for no other purpose. That's right. Than to show mankind the road to freedom. They're condescending saviors. They come to us by their so-called pity from some judgment hall. But I'm here as a sample of the example to show you that you can bring yourself up with your own bootstraps, and you can become your God, not in condescension, but in resurrection, in upliftment from whatever condition, economic income, or racism you might have had to endure. And you rest in peace. We ask for no condescension. We want no help from some judgment that has been bound up on us too long. Now we are looking to the key that is within every heart and breast. And I, God that came from the earth of earth, the dust of this toilsome fields, and the hardships of labor, from the lowest of economic positions, from the misery of poverty near the railroad tracks, I came to show you that the only God you need is within you. None other. That's my only purpose in being here. When that transition comes, there shall be no need for gods, any other kind of ideology, rituals, tradition, and religion. The opiate of the people shall be removed from the consciousness of all mankind. There shall be no longer further need for anything religious when freedom comes.
Okay, so we're going to stop it there. As you can see, there will be no need for anything religious when freedom comes.
Again, a smart guy. This was 1971. It says that's when that video was from, which is 3 years after Martin Luther King was killed. And if you listen to him and you look at him, his mannerisms, all of it, he is completely trying to be MLK. He is mimicking him because he knows it's going to work. It's all an act.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, also the brilliance of him is that he infiltrated a group of people who are easily manipulated, and no, people aren't going to like this, but religious people. He played to their faith. He
played to their hope. Their hope, Jeff.
Yeah,
you got to throw that in. That's what makes them easily manipulatable. Sometimes is they have real hope.
Right. He presented himself as a man of God. And then he pulled the rug out from under him and said, "Well, you don't really need a religion here. You don't really need it."
Well,
there is no God. That was what he was saying. Yeah, there's no guy God.
And that's a thing too. There's one from him from 1961 that I found. It's just audio, and it's really hard to hear. But he in that is even saying the same thing, that he's basically preaching atheism. He figured out that humanism is the way to go long before humanism became, part of the lexicon in the world, in this country. He was ahead of his time, and he was dangerously brilliant and good at it.
And if you hear that congregation responding to what he's saying in the 71 clip that we just heard, he was moving God and religion out, and he was making it all about when the freedom comes and I will lead you there, and the God is inside of you, essentially meaning the God is me and I'm inside of you and I will be the one. But he already had him. He
already had him.
7 years before the massacre, he already had him.
And Jeff, just really quickly, in the beginning, the people that did follow him, especially when they moved to California, they weren't religious people. That's the hook with him. These weren't typical cult members. These were people, these were activists, that kind of thing. People who were fighting for justice and something to believe in, like Greg said.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing he did. Yeah, he played to a good cause.
But he was
social justice.
He did, yeah.
For that reason, yeah.
And he was so good, though, at what he did that he was able to get these people who were not God freaks. These aren't Seventh-day Adventists. They're not, right? They're not that kind of person. He was able to get non-evangelical people to buy him hook, line, and sinker because of his message. And he knew what he was doing the entire time.
So let's talk a little bit about when the People's Temple moves to San Francisco, because this is really, if there was a peak, if there was a high water mark for this movement of the People's Temple, this was it. Within 5 years of the move to actual California, the temple experienced a period of exponential growth. They opened up branches in San Fernando, San Francisco, Los Angeles. By the early 70s, he began shifting the focus to major cities across California because he saw that there was limited expansion opportunities in Ukiah. So he essentially moved the temple's headquarters to San Francisco, and this is where they became a major force in the protesting, the social justice protesting that was going on at that time,
and politics. He was rubbing elbows, serious elbows.
So you mentioned politics. So George Mosconi's election as mayor in 1975, a huge part of that is attributed to the influence of the People's Temple getting out there and in their sheer numbers, creating a movement that many believe got George Mosconi elected mayor. He also forged alliances with a couple of key journalists, columnists, and eventually he actually agreed to some media involvement with the People's Temple. But there's clips out there where he's telling them, I'm very uncomfortable with the photographing you're doing in here. He didn't like opening the door to the People's Temple, but to a degree he did allow it. Now, around that time, there was a Chronicle reporter named Marshall Kilduff who was doing an investigative piece about the People's Temple, and he had talked to defectors, and he knew what was going on with the abuses and things like that. In the summer of 1977, this is when Jones and several hundred followers abruptly decided to move to Guyana, which is a country in South America, to open up this commune in the jungle called Jonestown, which had been under construction since 1976. In 1974 is when Jones leased like 4,000 acres of Guyana land from the Guyanese government. And he believed that this would make the perfect sort of place for his utopia, and the arrangement he had with Guyana would essentially make it that there would be no interference from the Guyana government in what Jonestown, the actions that took place in Jonestown. So while Jonestown was being built, and they were building the community there, they were building structures and housing, and they were trying to get the infrastructure of a utopian village going, where the followers could have their heaven on earth, right? So around 50 or 60 of his followers began building the People's Temple compound in the middle of the jungle. It was officially known as the People's Temple Agricultural Project.
Yep.
But it was the building of this. I mean, how can you not see Colonel Kurtz, in Apocalypse Now?
Yeah.
The god in the jungle who has mobilized the troops. It's eerily similar. Anyway, this article by Kilduff was about to hit, and Jones knew that the fallout would be astronomical. It would be destructive, very destructive to his movement. And that's when they decided to get the hell out of Dodge as quick as possible. So about 1,000 people went, and eventually, well, they didn't all go at once, but eventually 1,000 people did make the pilgrimage to Jonestown. So let's talk a little bit about Jonestown. It was promoted, the idea of it was promoted as a means to create a socialist paradise, a sanctuary from the media scrutiny in San Francisco. He said it was a model communist community, the purest communist there would be. And he did not permit members to leave the settlement. Okay, so once you were there, you know, it's like Hotel California. You could check out, but you can't ever leave. So he also, because
although he denies that, to be fair, he denied that he kept them there.
He said that they could leave, that everybody was free to leave. He began to propagate the belief in what he termed translation. Once his followers settled in Jonestown, claiming that he and his followers would all die together, move to another planet, and live blissfully. Now, this idea of mass suicide must have been something that Jones, for decades, was obsessed with. Because
you think so? You think decades? Okay.
Yes, because he had to have been thinking about it for a while to even try it, and we started trying it very early, where he would do these dry runs, where he would give the whole. I was going
to say, wasn't he training his congregation to do it? Yeah,
he was conditioning them. So essentially, he would hand out, like one time, he would hand out these cups of Kool-Aid, right, and the whole congregation would drink, and they would toast and everything. And as soon as everybody drank, in order to see what would happen, he said, "You've all just drank poison. You have 2 minutes to live." Yeah. And he would see what their reaction would be. And this activity, these test runs of the mass suicide, the execution of a mass suicide, was something that he continued in dry run forms all the way through being in California, all the way to the point where they were in Guyana, in Jonestown. And then it would be an every night thing for a while, where it would be this mock mass suicide. Lee, I think you had something there.
Yeah, and again, it's very culty to do that. He was grooming people to be okay with that. Heaven's Gate did the same thing. David Koresh did the same thing. The Manson family kind of did the same thing. That is a go-to move, the suicide thing. But I don't know that he did have that in his head for decades, but there was a point where it definitely started. You're right. And they would do they called them drills. The people in the congregation, if they were drills, they would say, okay, they're coming for us. And
they were called White Knights.
Yeah, I was going to say White Knights, right?
Yeah, and there was they were the good guys, right? They were doing it right. And because they were doing it right and they were socialists and communists, the government was coming for you. And they're going to take away your rights and blah, blah, blah. So we can't let them do that. They're going to take your kids and make them, democratic. So you need to be prepared. It's going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. These people were prepared for years to do this.
The reason I think that he was obsessed with it for years was because I think that Jones's main motivation, ever since he became aware of himself, the organism that he was born, I think once he realized that he could bend the wills of others, the ultimate accomplishment of that would have been talking people into killing themselves. I think it held a morbid sexual fascination for him, an obsessive sort of thing.
That's
when I say sexual, I don't want to overstate the sexual part, but I think it was like the highest level of excitement he could reach was this idea of being able to talk people into their own deaths.
And he is a sadist. You're probably right. He definitely got off on it, but also towards the end, and I don't know if you'll get there, he developed a incredible cocaine problem.
Yeah, so we are going to get there. Okay. Jones becomes completely unstable by the end. But now let's talk a little bit about the funding for Jonestown. Much of this comes from an article by a journalist named Reitman in the Times. Although Jonestown contained no dedicated prison, no form of capital punishment, various forms of punishment were used against the members considered to have serious disciplinary problems. In addition to the spankings that he would do up front in front of the congregation of his parishioners, disciplinary methods include imprisonment in a 6x4 by 3 foot plywood box, sometimes forcing children to spend a night at the bottom of a well, sometimes upside down. This torture hole, along with beatings, became the subject of a rumor among local Guyanese. For some members who attempted to escape, drugs such as thorazine, sodium pentothal, chloral hydrate, drugs were administered in an extended care unit. Armed guards patrolled the area day and night. There were women. There was a woman named Lindsay Wagner Wilson, who eventually, when things turned into a living nightmare, escaped into the jungle with her child. Can you imagine the state of desperation you'd have to be in for that to be the thing you do to save your own life? Run headlong into the jungle for safety. Think about that. But these people, Lindsay Wagner Wilson said that her husband was part of Jones's honor guard, like this ragtag army he had with him. And she believed fully that if it meant keeping them at Jonestown, that he would not, that her own husband would not hesitate to murder her and her son. Mm-hmm. Or I'm sorry, murder her, shoot her in the head, and take the son back to Jonestown. So the children were generally surrendered to communal care. They were only allowed to see their biological parents briefly at night in Jonestown. Jim Jones was called father or dad by both adults and children. And for a year, it appears the commune was run almost primarily through the Social Security checks received by members. Up to $65,000 in monthly welfare payments from U.S. government agencies to Jonestown residents were signed over to the temple. In 1978, officials from the U.S. Embassy in Georgetown interviewed Social Security recipients on multiple occasions to make sure they were not being held against their will. None of the 75 people interviewed by the embassy stated that they were being held captive or were forced to sign over welfare checks or that they wanted to leave Jonestown. So things begin to really fall out of control here. There was pressure. There was waning political support. So this group got together called the Concerned Relatives. These were both defectors from the People's Temple and also family members of the People's Temple parishioners. They distributed a packet of documents, letters, and affidavits to the People's Temple, members of the press, and members of Congress, which they titled An Accusation of Human Rights Violation by Reverend James Warren Jones. In June of 1978, escaped Temple member Deborah Layton, who was one of Jones's close associates and a mistress of his at one point, provided the group with further affidavit detailing crimes by the Temple and the living conditions. Jones was facing increasing scrutiny in the summer of 78 when he hired JFK assassin conspiracy theorist Mark Lane and Donald Freed to help make the case of a grand conspiracy against the temple by U.S. intelligence agencies. He told them that he wanted to pull an Eldridge Cleaver, referring to a fugitive member of the Black Panthers who was able to return to the U.S. after rebuilding his reputation. So Jones is already trying to figure out how, now that I'm here, if this all goes sour, was he trying to figure out a way back? I don't know. But things definitely started to fall off the rails. Exploring another potential exodus. This was thoughts about leaving Guyana. So at one point there were these white knights we talked about, and he would call them the 6-day siege, in which the fear of being held in contempt of the orders caused Jones to set up a false sniper attack upon himself and begin the first series of white knights called the 6-day siege. During the siege, he spoke to temple members about attacks from outsiders and had them surround Jonestown with guns and machetes. The rallies took an almost surreal tone as black activists communicated via radio telephone to the Jonestown crowd, urging them to hold strong against the conspiracy. Jones made radio broadcasts stating, "We will die unless we are granted freedom from harassment and asylum." Deputy Minister Reed finally assured Marceline Jones that the Guyana Defense Force would not invade Jonestown. So this all started to unravel, and Jones started to really, really, really feel the pressure. Okay, so then you started to see Jones declining physically and mentally, and we're about to go to another break here in just a moment. But his health significantly declined in Jonestown around 1978. He was informed of a possible lung infection, upon which he announced to his followers that in fact he had lung cancer, which was not true. That was to ploy sympathy, to foster sympathy. And he said he was said to be abusing injectable Valium, Quaaludes, stimulants, and barbiturates. Audio tapes of 1978 meetings within Jonestown attest to Jones' declining physical condition, with the commune leader complaining of high blood pressure, which he had apparently since the 50s.
Yes.
There was small strokes, weight loss of 30 to 40 pounds, temporary blindness, convulsions, and a grotesque swelling of the extremities. He had chronic insomnia. He would often say that he went for 3 to 4 days with no sleep. So when Reitman, the guy that did one of the pieces on Jonestown, he was very surprised by the severe deterioration of Jones's health when he saw him in Jonestown in November of 78. After covering him for 18 months for the Examiner, he said it was shocking to see his glazed eyes and festering paranoia face to face, to realize nearly 1,000 lives, ours included, were in his hands. So we're going to break at that point, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how it all fell apart, as bad as anything in history ever has fallen apart, when we talk about the murder of a U.S. congressman and the mass suicide of over 900 people in Jonestown. We're going to get
mass murder.
More mass murder. You get them with these cults, Jeff. You know, you're going to get this. So we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how things really unraveled in the end, and the just really creepy, depressing, scary event that happened. You're actually going to hear audio from those final moments. And I do warn you, for anybody that would be upset by something like that, when we start the audio, you may want to tag out, because it's going to be very upsetting to hear if you have not heard it before. But with that, we will be right back.
Welcome back to the Ever-Evolving Truth. We are 3 segments deep. We're about to start our 3rd segment on Jonestown, Jim Jones. And as Greg promised, this is going to be the darkest of those segments.
It's the darkest of the dark and twisties.
Yeah. This is one of the most disgusting, horrible things in modern history.
It defines tragedy.
It does. And I think part of it is that a man figured out how to play on people's faith. Mm-hmm. And just positive social, at a time where there wasn't many people, especially white people, in positions of power or authority fighting for minorities or social justice. He used those things that were generally good. Mm-hmm. And people who had faith, which is generally a good. I don't want to say a good thing. I have my problems with people who just rely solely on faith and nothing else. But the intention of them is generally good. They want to do good things, and he preyed on that and essentially took advantage so much of gullible people. Mm-hmm. And then it just turned it into one of the most horrible tragedies ever. And I have my thoughts on why anybody who considers this a mass suicide is wrong.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll get to that at the end if we have some time. But I wanted to point that out because Greg's lovely wife, Abby, mentioned something about, I think last week we talked about, someone said, it was probably Yulia, that said all religious people are stupid.
That was me. Yeah.
It was you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Oh, that was Jeff.
That's
right. It was Jeff.
Yeah, you started it on the Waco episode.
Okay, well, I want to defend myself there. It's maybe stupid is the wrong word, but gullible. Don't you think that religious people in general are pretty gullible? I mean, they're not believing. They're not. Their belief isn't based on any sort of scientific fact. They throw it all out the window for faith. I'm not saying that they're bad people. I'm not saying stupid was the wrong word, but they are easily manipulated. Back then and here right now today, evangelicals were convinced by Trump to be, he's the second coming of Jesus. Like I could. We don't have enough time, obviously, but I could go down an endless list of examples.
No, real quick, Jeff. So you're talking about when religion goes bad, like if the gullibility, if you want to use that word, I look at it more like when you have high hope for mm-hmm. something greater than yourself, something greater than this human experience of ours, that hope can drive you to wanting to believe so badly in certain things that it's sort of the echo chamber thing we talk about. Like you just want to keep having the same shit fed back to you and kind of block everything else out. And eventually you can become too entrenched in that where you become closed off to other ideas. When you get to that point, that's not a good place to be. And the people of Jonestown got to that point, and then about 10 miles down that road, to what led to this.
But there's examples of that happening on much smaller levels. Like obviously it doesn't end in the tragedy, but it's a real problem. And these are the same tactics we see ISIS radicalizing Americans against their own people. Like it's
one thing that they have in common, and this is religious, political, any kind of strong ideology, right? The best way to control people is through fear.
Yeah.
And Jim Jones instilled a fear of the outside world into his congregants. And that's what David Koresh did, and that's what Charles Manson did.
The world from outside, the world that had the conspiracy against the People's Temple was the common enemy that Father Divine taught Jim Jones to create.
Yes.
Right. But and my bigger point here is that that's the basis of all religion. Is if you don't follow you don't worship me, you go to hell, and that's going to be the worst torture for the eternity, not the rest of your life.
That is the basis. Eternity. That is the basis, at least, of some religions. The Abrahamic religions, you'd have an argument to make. So that would not fit Eastern religions really at all.
That's true, like Buddhism and stuff like that. Yeah.
So now we have a lot to go over here. So let's try to get to it here. Now,
take it away.
Eventually, the People's Temple started to attract the wrong kind of attention, and this concerned relatives group. So the concerned relatives group started making a lot of noise, and they got the attention of the local California government to the point where a congressman named Leo Ryan decided to do a fact-finding mission to Jonestown. He decided to go down there with an entourage, a contingent from California, and he went to see what was going on. So now you can imagine for Jones, he's already trying to drive this conspiracy theory that they're coming to get us, right? Is it because he's trying to ratchet it? He has them isolated now in Jonestown, and he's really trying to ratchet up that final moment where he can execute his obsessive dream of the mass suicide, getting everybody to go along and cooperate with it? Was he trying to present the congressman was, look, here it is. They're coming to get us. They've sent their representative. They're going to come. They're going to tell lies about us, and they're going to come bomb us from the skies, right? So I don't think Ryan was ever getting out of there. But according to the Jones plan, I don't think Ryan and his entourage was ever getting out of there. So let's talk a little bit about it. Most of this comes from the book Raven, The Untold Story of Jim Jones. And I sloppily did not put the author's name there, but you can look it up. When the Ryan delegation arrived in Guyana, they initially refused to allow them access to Jonestown. By the morning of the 17th, they informed Jones that Ryan likely would leave Jonestown that afternoon, regardless of his willingness. Ryan's party, accompanied by an attorney, Gary, a couple other people. I won't go into that just yet. They came to an airstrip in Port Kaituma, 6 miles from Jonestown, and that is where they were eventually shot. However, let's go through some of the finer points here. Sorry, I lost my place for a second. So his delegation included relatives of temple members, those concerned citizens group, or concerned relatives group, an NBC camera crew, and reporters for various newspapers, as well as members of his own staff. The group arrived in the Guyanese capital of Georgetown on the 15th. 2 days later, they traveled by airplane to Port Kaituma when they were transported to Jonestown in a tractor transporter. Jones hosted a reception for the delegation that evening at the Central Pavilion in Jonestown, and this plays like a happy family reunion or something. There's music, there's dancing, there's people are feeling good and happy, and Leo Ryan actually got up on the microphone and said, I came here for a fact-finding mission just to see what was happening with the operation you've built here, and I have to say, in spite of the questions that are being asked, I've met some people who say this is the best thing that ever happened in their lives. And it seemed like Leo Ryan was going to go back and give a positive report, but that did not fit Jim Jones's narrative that he was already too far down the line in selling to the People's Temple. So when most of the Ryan... so at this time...
Wasn't he also slipped a letter, like in private?
Yes. Thank you. So after the reception... Temple member Vernon Gosney passed a note meant for Ryan to one of the NBC reporters requesting assistance for himself and another Temple member, Monica Bagby, to leave the settlement. Help us get out of Jonestown, it said. While most of the Ryan delegation began to depart on a large dump truck to the Port Kaituma airstrip, Ryan and Dwyer, who was deputy chief of mission of the U.S. Embassy to Guyana, named Richard Dwyer, stayed behind in Jonestown to process any additional defectors, of which there were a number of them. Shortly before the dump truck left, a Temple loyalist Larry Layton, who was the brother of Deborah Layton, you'll remember she was one of the mistresses, former close associate of Jones and eventually a defector herself, he demanded to join the group, as though he wanted to leave with them. Several defectors voiced their suspicions about Larry Layton's motives, which they had good reason to be suspicious of. Shortly after the dump truck initially departed, Temple member Don Sly grabbed Ryan while wielding a knife, trying to hurt the congressman. While Ryan remained unhurt and others wrestled Sly to the ground, Dwyer strongly suggested the congressman leave Jonestown while he filed a criminal complaint against Sly. Ryan did so, promising to return later to address the dispute. The truck departing to the airstrip had stopped after the passengers heard of the attack on Ryan and took him as a passenger before continuing its journey toward the airstrip. The entourage had originally scheduled a 19-passenger Twin Otter from Guyana Airways to fly them back to Georgetown. Because of the defectors departing Jonestown, the group grew in number, and now an additional aircraft was required because of the defectors that they're going to take back with them. According to the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. Embassy arranged for a second plane, a 6-passenger Cessna. When the entourage reached the airstrip between 4:30 and 4:45 p.m., the planes had not appeared as scheduled. The group had to wait until the aircraft landed at approximately 5:10 p.m. Then the boarding process began. Larry Layton was the man on the inside in this plot. He was Jim Jones's man on the inside. He was a passenger on the Cessna, the first aircraft to set up for takeoff. After it had been taxied to the far end of the airstrip, Layton produced a handgun and started shooting at the passengers inside. He wounded Bagby and Gosney and tried to kill Dale Parks, who disarmed him after the gun misfired. He was eventually tried in the U.S. later and was given a life sentence, but he was eventually released in 2002. Meanwhile, some passengers had boarded the larger Twin Otter. A tractor with a trailer attached, driven by members of the temple's Red Brigade security squad, arrived at the airstrip and approached the Twin Otter. When the tractor neared within approximately 30 feet of the aircraft at a time roughly concurrent with the shootings on the Cessna, the Red Brigade opened fire with shotguns, handguns, and rifles, while at least two shooters circled the plane on foot. There were perhaps 9 shooters whose identities are not all certainly known, but most sources agree that Joe Wilson, Stanley Grigg, Thomas Kice Sr., and Ronnie Dennis were among them. The first few seconds of the shooting were captured as an ENG video recording by the NBC cameraman Bob Brown, who was killed along with Robinson, Harris, and Temple defector Patricia Parks in the few minutes of shooting. Congressman Ryan was killed after being shot more than 20 times. Jackie Spire, and can you imagine, less than 24 hours before, he was telling the people of Jonestown, this is the best thing that ever happened to some of you. He was smiling. He never made it out of there. He was never going to make it out of there. And just watching him now, he didn't know it at the time, but he was never getting out of Jonestown.
You know what this reminds me of? Like the end of a bad 80s action movie where you know that it's going to turn out like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so after the shootings, the Cessna pilots, along with the pilot and co-pilot of the Twin Otter, as well as the injured Monica Bagby, fled in the Cessna to Georgetown. The damaged Twin Otter and the injured Ryan delegation members were left behind on the airstrip for hours upon hours. Okay, so now that that's happened, the People's Temple's fucked real bad. So this was all part of the plan, though, is the crazy part. It seems this was all part of the plan. This was Jim Jones's plan. So before leaving Jonestown for the airstrip, Ryan had actually told Charles Gary, an American civil rights attorney who represented the People's Temple in Jonestown during the 78 tragedy that occurred, he told him he would issue a report that would describe Jonestown in basically good terms. Ryan stated that none of the 60 relatives he had targeted for interviews wanted to leave. The 14 defectors constituted a very small portion of the residents, and any sense of imprisonment the defectors had was likely because of peer pressure, lack of physical transportation, and even if the 200 or the 900 wanted to leave, I'd still say you have a beautiful place here. This was what Ryan was going to go back and report. But again, not part of Jim Jones's plan. So now we are at the point where the mass suicide is about to take place. So now some of the People's Temple members have fled. Some of them have fled into the jungle. Some of them left on the Cessna. It's all over at this point for the vision. There's no keeping this vision up anymore. So now Jim Jones has decided revolutionary suicide by the entire People's Temple is what is required to prove a message to the world that this world was too cruel for them, and they were making a voluntary protest about what a wrong world it was by doing this. And instead of having me sit here and tell you about it, we're gonna hear it from Jim Jones himself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a video that some call the death tape, and this is really disturbing, folks. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm going to play the first 2 minutes here really quick. This is the intro. This is the first thing that the populace of Jonestown is hearing, and it's Jim Jones. I want you to remember how he sounded in that 71 tape, and listen to this. Imagine you are in Jonestown. You just the night before had this wonderful little party, and the congressman told you that we think you got a beautiful thing going here, and things seem to be okay. The next day, all hell breaks out. Jones is paranoid as fuck. He's coked out of his mind. He's on all kinds of drugs. He's paranoid as hell, and he believes that now is the time, because they're coming to get him anyway. They're not going to let a guy like him go on for too long. Now is the time when he can execute his ultimate plan of control. So just listen to this and see if it doesn't make your skin crawl.
How very much I've loved you. How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. But in spite of all of that I've tried, a handful of our people, with their lies, have made our life impossible. There's no way to detach ourselves from what's happened today. Not only we're in a compound situation, not only are there those who have left and committed the betrayal of the century, some have stolen children from others, and they're in pursuit right now to kill them because they stole their children. And we are sitting here waiting on a powder keg. I don't think this is what we want to do with our babies. I don't think that's what we had in mind to do with our babies. It was said by the greatest of prophets from time immemorial, no man takes my life from me, I lay my life down. So to sit here and wait for the catastrophe that's going to happen on that airplane, it's going to be a catastrophe. Almost happened here. Almost happened. The congressman was nearly killed here. But you can't steal people's children. You can't take off with people's children without expecting a violent reaction. And that's not so unfamiliar to us either. Even if we were Judeo-Christian, if we weren't communists, the world, the kingdom suffereth violence, and the violence shall take it by force. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed.
All right, now I'm going to fast forward a little bit. You just hear, I don't know what I don't know. Yeah, they're cheering what he's saying, and essentially he's already alluding to suicide. Yeah. He already said the congressman was going to be killed here. Mm-hmm. He's basically saying that like people from the temple defected and caused all this to happen. Now the world would never forgive the People's Temple. Mm-hmm. Here is the first out and out mention of the suicide plea. I call these the suicide pleas in this tape. Here's the first one. It's about 3 minutes and 10 seconds in. I'm just going to play a little tiny bit of it, and then you'll see for yourself.
Fortunately, being so bewildered with many pressures on my brain, seeing all these people behave so treasonous, it was just too much for me to put together. But I now know what he was telling me, and it'll happen if the plane gets in the air even. So my opinion is that we be kind to children and be kind to seniors and take the portion like they used to take in ancient Greece and step over quietly, because we are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act. We can't go back. They won't leave us alone. They're now going back to tell more lies, which means more congressmen, and there's no way we can survive.
So even now, he's still performing. He just out and out made the suicide plea. He's still performing, though, because earlier in this day, he was talking completely, well, not completely normally, but a lot more normally when this letter was handed to him that Leah was alluding to. And he doesn't have this sort of like elderly black woman affectation in his voice, which the really heavy lisp and all that. So now we're going to fast forward quite a bit. This is about 17-minute mark, and now some of the members are starting to speak up. And let's hear a little bit of this about 17 minutes into this recording, and here it is.
I don't want to see this, Christine, because they got to shoot me to get through to some of these people. I'm not letting them take your jar. Can you let them take your jar?
See John die?
What's that?
You mean you want to see John, the little one, the kid?
I want to see.
Christy, are you saying that you think he thinks more of them than other children here? That's what you're saying.
But you act, and you think I'd put John's life above others? If I put John's life above others, I wouldn't be standing with his jar. I'd send John out. He could go out on the driveway tonight.
Because he's young. They're young.
I know, but he's no different to me than any of these children here. He's just one of my children. I don't prefer one another. I don't prefer him above you, Jara. I can't do that. I can't separate myself from your actions or his actions. If you've done something wrong, I'd stand with you. If they wanted to come and get you, they'd have to take me.
Okay. So now we're gonna speed up a little bit more. Now this is about 22 minutes in. The members are saying end it, and the first out and out mention of the congressman's murder happens here at this point in the tape. So let me go ahead and get us there, right around the 21-minute mark, 21:29, I think, on this tape. So let's just listen in.
Yes, my love.
At one time, I felt just like Christine felt. But after today, I don't feel anything because the biggest majority of the people that left here were white. And I know it really hurt my heart because
Broke your heart,
it broke my heart to think that all of these years that these white people have been with us and not a part of us. So we might as well end it now because I don't see.
Talking, the congressman has been murdered. It's all over, all over.
What a legacy. What a legacy. But the Red Brigade's the only ones that ever made any sense anyway. They invaded our privacy. They came into our home. They followed us 6,000 miles away. The Red Brigade showed them justice. The congressman's dead.
He's calling it justice.
Please get us some medication. It's simple. It's simple. There's no convulsions with it. It's just simple. Just please get it. Before it's too late, the GDF will be here. I tell you, get moving. Get moving. Get moving. Don't be afraid to die.
You're muted, Leah.
These people land out here. They'll torture some of our children here. They'll torture our people. They'll torture our seniors. We cannot have this.
Okay, so Leah, you want to say something quick? I did want to point out real quick that he called the congressman's murder justice.
Yes.
And he's also once again, can we please get the medication? We just eventually he gets so impatient in this solution being passed around that they all took the Flavor Aid with the cyanide in it. He gets so impatient by the end that even when the parishioners are praising him, he's basically like, come on, get on with it. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. We'll hear that as time goes on. Did you have something, Leah, before the next section here?
Well, just the fear thing. He has groomed these people, and just to try and understand why these people did what they did, I think you have to put this into perspective. He's been grooming them this whole time. He's been playing on their biggest fears. And these are people who, like Sterner said, have hope and believe truly in what they're doing. And they think that their suicide, their death, is going to mean something. If they don't kill themselves now, this is a statement. We're going to make this statement, and we're going to change the world with our deaths. That's what these people believe. They're not, that's why they're not afraid, because they're dying for a cause. And that's why they're, giving their children cyanide.
Which is why it's murder. Everything you just said makes it murder.
Absolutely, it's murder. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, you could definitely argue that Jim Jones murdered 900 people here, but he murdered them with his mind. That's essentially what happened. Now, the Red Brigade and his own private army apparently also were pushing some of those syringes and holding up the gun and saying, yeah, you're going to drink it.
Yeah.
That was also happening.
Which is also murder.
Yes, but many of them certainly gave up willingly. So I had one other section here. I'm going to skip that just for time constraints. We're going to move to about the 30-minute mark here. This is where the members are praising Jim Jones, and Jones makes an allusion to the the idea that he might actually live and move on from this and go on from this.
Oh, yeah.
Listen for that. But just listen to the irritation. He hates these people, and he's waiting for them to shut up, even as they're proclaiming their love for him as they're about to die for him.
Just shut up and die. Yeah.
Right. I mean, so we're gonna go to about the 30-minute, 30-second mark here, and man, does this get more and more surreal every second that goes by. So let's have another listen.
Wouldn't be alive today. I just like to thank Dad because he was the only one that stood up for me when I needed him. And thank you, Dad.
We call him Father and Dad. That's what he's referring to.
You're my brothers and sisters, and I'm glad to be here. Okay.
Please, for God's sakes, let's get on with it. We've lived as no other people have lived and loved. We've had as much of this world as you're going to get. Let's just be done with it. Let's be done with the agony of it. It's far, far harder to have to watch you every day die slowly. And from the time you're a child to the time you get gray, you're dying. Dishonest, and I'm sure that they'll pay for it. They'll pay for it. This is a revolutionary suicide. This is not a self-destructive suicide. So they'll pay for this. They brought this upon us, and they'll pay for that.
This is a revolution. This is very similar to Trump's insurrectionism. It is.
I think it's humane. I want to see you go, though. They can take me and do with me whatever they want to do. I want to see you go. I don't want to see you go through this hell no more.
So you notice there, he says they can take me, do whatever they're going to do. Maybe in his mind, he's still going to move on from this. I don't know. We'll talk about that when we talk about Jones's death himself. But I have one more clip then. But if you noticed in the background there, you can hear the children screaming. Who were being administered this very bitter tasting poison and then having it washed down with in this drink. But they were crying that they were being forced to take this, and you can hear it. You can also hear at one point Marceline herself loses it and starts begging him to stop. Yeah. And I'm not sure if I'm going to get it on the clip here. I might, but he's sort of like basically saying to her, please don't be this way. Lay down your life for your children. Don't be like this now. He's basically like, he doesn't even give a fuck what she says anymore. No. This is going to happen one way or the other. So the last part here, guys, is pretty terrible. But this is the last minutes of this event. And we're going to start here. It's about 2 minutes long, and this is the end.
Is that my so-called parents was filled with so much hate.
Stop this crying and hollering.
Out here should think about how your relatives was and be glad about that the children are being laid to rest. And all I like to say is I thank Dad for making me strong to stand with it all and make me ready for it. Thank you.
Talking to them, all they're doing is taking a drink to go to sleep. That's what death is, sleep. Whatever, I'm tired of it all.
Loving thing he could have ever done, the most loving thing all of us could have done. And it's been a pleasure walking with all of you in this revolutionary struggle. No other way I would rather go than give my life for socialism, communism. And I thank Dad very, very much.
That Dad's love and mercy and goodness and kindness and bringing us to this land of freedom. His love, his mother was the advance guard to socialism. And his love and his mercy should go on forever, on to the fields.
Where's the vat? Where's the vat with the green C?
Go on forever to the pine. And thank you, Dad.
The vat with the green C in, please. Bring it here so the adults can begin.
So the adults can begin.
Don't fail to follow my advice, you'll be sorry. You'll be sorry. That we do it than that they do it.
Still threatening.
Just trust you. You have to step across. We used to sing this world's not our home. Well, it sure isn't. As we were saying, it sure wasn't. He doesn't want to tell him. All he's doing, if they will tell him, assure these children. Some people assure these children of the relaxation of stepping over to the next plane. So set an example for others.
He's annoyed by them.
1,000 people who say we don't like the way the world is. Take our life from us. We laid it down. We got tired. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. I'm going to quit this sharing view and go back to you guys. All right, so the organ music just continues to play for another 2 minutes there at the end of the tape. It's so creepy.
Yeah.
Right? Are we to assume that the silence there are the kids dying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's not an assumption. They know. There are people that fled when they started seeing the kids die, and supposedly when Marceline does lose it, the reason she did is because he started administering it to her grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And she freaked out then.
Mounts, when you wrote that note about Reiderman and Jacobs, were they the ones that wrote Raven?
Yeah.
Okay. So Reiderman also wrote that article. So when I was mentioning Reiderman earlier, that's the same guy that eventually wrote Raven.
Mm-hmm.
The silence at the end is just it's heartbreaking. Now let's talk briefly though about what happened to Jim Jones. So Jim Jones did not drink the Kool-Aid. Okay, that famous phrase about drinking the Kool-Aid, this is where it comes from. For those of you that haven't put that together yet, that's where this comes from. And he never drank it, but he died of a bullet wound to the head behind his temple. So people aren't quite sure if he accomplished his great goal. He had his figurative orgasm of all orgasms and talked these people into death. Did he just say, okay, fuck it, now I'm going to, I did it, and just shoot himself? Or did someone in his inner circle finally take him down far, far too late? But did they finally take him down? That's still an open question.
Well, from what I understand, he had somebody kill him.
Well, that's a theory. That's a theory that he couldn't do it himself. If it was intentional, if he wanted to die, he definitely had someone do it. He's too much of a narcissist and a coward. That's why he runs away. He would have never killed himself on his own. Never.
Jeff, to speak to that, his son Stephen does believe his father may have directed someone else to shoot him. Mm-hmm. This is speculation. The autopsy also showed levels of the barbiturate pentobarbital, which may have been lethal to humans who had not developed physiological tolerance. So that's that's how fucked up he was at the time. Mm-hmm. Let's talk very briefly, since I know we're running long. This is a long episode, but you can't get through Jonestown in an hour. You just can't. Mm-hmm. So on the final morning of the visit, Joan's wife, Marceline, eventually she took reporters on a tour of Jonestown. Later that same day, she was found dead at the pavilion, having been poisoned. Did Marceline take the solution voluntarily, knowing that her life was now over and the mass murder of all these children had happened, or was it given to her? Who knows? I just know that when she was protesting, there's a segment in that tape that we didn't get to hear where he's like, mother, 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 please, mother, 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 please. And it's so, he's talking to his wife at that point. Mm-hmm. Anyway, Stephen, Jim Jr., and Tim Jones survived the events of November 18th because, being members of the People's Temple basketball team, they were playing an away game in Georgetown at the time of the mass poisoning. Stephen and Tim were both 19. Jim Jones Jr. was 18. Tim's biological family, which consisted of his sisters, Janet. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of that. Okay, Stephen got into a little bit of trouble. He was accused of being involved in the Georgetown deaths of... and they were replaced in a Guyanese prison for 3 months. Mm-hmm. But he eventually did return to the U.S., and the children have lived relatively peacefully, although haunted and scarred by this, I'm sure. Lou and Agnes, the other children, Jones, both died at Jonestown. Agnes was 35. Her husband, Forrest, and 4 children, Billy, Jimbo, Michael, and Stephanie, all died in Jonestown. Lou, who was 21 years old at the time of his death, died alongside his wife, Terry, and son, Cherokee. Stephanie Jones had died at age 5 in a car accident, so obviously she was not involved here. Okay, and
I find it interesting. I think it's important that you know that he called both his boys that were away and demanded them to come back. And when they said no, he said, then you need to kill yourself now. Go kill yourself. That's the kind of power he had. He really thought he can call his kids and be like, go off yourself, and they would do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, to explain some of the power that they did have, I wanted to play the audio for it. The audio is going to be a little spotty, so I'm not going to bother. However, there was a teenager who was about 14 or 15 years old named Tom Bogue, and he had attempted an escape with a friend of his into the jungle. They were caught by the Red Brigade and brought back, at which point they were brought up on the pulpit and beaten by Jones, whipped by Jones, called them filth, and he called them insidious. And basically his own mother, Bogue's own mother, is heard on the tape saying that both of you are going to get what you deserve. You both deserve to be shot. Yeah. And I just hope that they let me be the one to do it. And that's exactly how she said. That's his own mother saying that. That's how deep this guy got into these people's heads. And it became this whole thing where, like, when you got the whole crowd shouting you down, very few people, as much as they'd like to say they could overcome that or speak out against it, most people can't. It's too much pressure. And we are social animals. When that pressure becomes focused and coordinated in one little area, and it's all shooting back at you, very few people have the power.
And also, you mentioned it's the fear of them getting beaten yourself. Like, how many of us could withstand or stand up for something knowing that we would have to withstand that type of beating?
It's hard. And he was smart too. You have to keep in mind that you heard on the tape, the kids got it first. Not one adult touched it until the children had all been administered and they started dying. As a parent, as a mother, even if I was so into it, right? Like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give it to my kids. The moment my kid starts writhing in pain or crying or screaming, you're going to second guess it. Then when that kid dies, what do you have to live for anymore?
Right, and that's where they messed up. They said that they put Valium and the cyanide worked before the Valium did. So
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so much for that, right?
Right.
As far as helping the pill go down a little easier, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is one of the saddest stories you'll ever hear, ever be able to see. That tape, that I've dreamt about that tape. I've had nightmares about that tape. It's crazy, and like I said, we've only really, even in 2 hours or whatever this is going to be, we barely scratched the surface of everything around Jonestown. There's so much more to the story. I advise you to read the books. I advise you watch the documentaries. Even the comedy podcast Last House on the Left did a 5-part, fantastic, hilarious, believe it or not, series on Jonestown, which is definitely worth a listen. And some of what was on that show certainly inspired us to do our own Teat version of Jonestown as part of our cult series. So what are your final thoughts on Jim Jones? I think for me, in the end, he was a creature born with a perverted will to bend the minds and wills of other people. And he was one of the most successful people in the history of the world at doing so. And he was downright as close as Leah said earlier, as close to being evil as just about anyone I can think of. And Jonestown has got to go down as one of the biggest American tragedies in history. That's my final take. What's your guys' final word on this?
I would say in the world, not just American tragedies. I would say global tragedies.
I'd agree.
I'd agree with you for the most part. But I think ultimate power ultimately corrupts. And Jim Jones is a great example of that. He started, you can't take away the fact that what he started originally was good. It was a good idea, and he took a good idea and he aborted it, and the power eventually went to his head. And if he couldn't have everyone do what he wanted, he was going to make sure they died. That's the type of person he was.
I'll never get the pictures of the aftermath out of my head.
Oh yeah, the bodies on
all over.
The people wearing the masks
on top of each other. Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that, Mounts. That's one of the worst things any of us have ever seen.
So
Just rows and rows of body, fathers and mothers with their arms around little tiny children, all face down in the dirt, dead of suicide. It's tragic and horrifying. Mounts, any other takeaway? Any other final thoughts on this one?
No, you guys said it all. It's to take something beautiful and turn this is the end is terrible.
Jeff?
Well, I've said it. It's not even remotely fathomable that this is mass suicide. This is mass murder. But I will point out, for someone that doesn't believe in one almighty God, this guy presented himself as a god and a prophet. Was he wrong? The power that he had over these people is godlike.
You're absolutely right.
He certainly became an otherworldly god in Jonestown. He absolutely did. For those people, he was God, but he was more like Satan on earth.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, even from the outside, for those of us that would never consider following a psychopath like this, like if you look at the definition of a god or a prophet, he checks a lot of those boxes.
Yeah.
Even from the outside, that's scary.
Well, and I don't know about you guys, but when you were watching some of these documentaries, I can think back years ago when I didn't really know the story of Jonestown that well at all, and I watched my first documentary on it, and at the beginning you're seeing like young Jim Jones when he's still preaching and everybody's happy. Try not to get a little bit convinced of what he's saying.
This is why I said it was the first cult I knew about, and it's the reason I think I could be culted. This was a perfect example.
Yeah. I agree with you, Leah, too, because even on 50-year-old tapes, his charisma still comes through. It's that powerful that it comes through on, half a century old film with bad audio. It still comes through to the point where you're like, I kind of want to believe the guy. He's so powerful in that way.
But also think about like Old Testament God who asked Abraham to kill his son, and he was willing to do it. Like, he kind of asked these people to do the same thing, like kill your children, and they were like, okay.
Yeah,
just trust me, it's going to pay off. And they're like, all right.
What was the difference between the devotion test of the White Knights versus the devotion test of God telling Abraham to kill Isaac?
Zero difference. It's just a little more modern. That's it. And it was in mass, not just one person saying, prove your faith to me. It was like a whole community. It's 1,000 people. Prove your faith to me. It's disgusting, and it's also proven that I made the right decision to stay away from religion altogether.
Yeah,
right?
But be careful though, Jeff, because religion is not the only way guys like this can get to guys like you.
I don't disagree.
And I will say this as my final word on the subject before Jeff does the final sign off here. Use Jonestown as your example and keep it fresh in your mind. Do not, under any circumstances, for whatever reason, let anyone else do your thinking for you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And don't be fooled. These tactics are being used on you through social media right now as we speak.
Yes, they are. Yes,
they are.
You're right.
And on that note, unless anybody has anything else, you're entitled to your own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts. Don't get culted.
Fuck you, culted.
Fuck you, getting culted. And we're going to go on vacation and have a great time. And we hope that you'll be able to survive without us for a week or two. Or like 10 days. And we will see you back here.
For Manson.